Today I'm going to show you how I made this custom down camp blanket. I'm going to be giving it away at the end of the video, so make sure to stick around. So first, I'm going to show my process for creating a custom fabric pattern. If you already have your fabric and don't want to do a custom print, you can skip to the sewing portion. There are many different creative programs you can use, but I'm going to use Adobe Photoshop. So I'm going to create new, and I'll just name mine pattern tutorial. You can set this up to whatever size you want, just make sure it is in 100% scale of what you want the final product to be. I'm going to make mine 7 inches by 6 inches. And just keep in mind that this is the size for just one block of the pattern and it's going to repeat across your entire piece of fabric. Set the resolution to 300 pixels per inch. And even though this is a print project, I'm going to set my color mode to RGB just because I've had success with it. If you're so inclined, feel free to set to CMYK. Click Create. And now that I have my canvas, I'm going to start putting together my design. I already have an idea of what I want this to look like, so I'm going to pick my background color and use the paint bucket tool. Pull up whatever illustrations you want to use. I created all of these using Adobe Illustrator. Select the few that you want to start with and drag them onto the canvas. Check the box to confirm each image. Now you can have fun playing around with the layout of the design. Just make sure to stay away from the edges. Once you're happy with this, open up the Layers panel. Select all the images and the background layer together by clicking the first image, hold Shift, and then click the last image. With your cursor hovering over the Layers panel, right-click and select Merge Layers. Now that we have this one image, we want to offset the design to create a repeating pattern. Select the image layer, come up to the top bar, and select Filter, Other, Offset. I want to offset my design 50% horizontally and 50% vertically, so I'm going to need to calculate how many pixels that is. I'm going to pull up my calculator. Remember, the width of my canvas is set to 7 inches and the resolution is 300 pixels per inch. So the total width of my design is 7 times 300, which is 2100. To get 50% of that, divide that by 2. And my final number is 1050. So I want to set the horizontal coordinate 1050 pixels to the right. Same with the vertical axis. My height is set to 6 inches, so I multiply 6 by 300 and divide that by 2. So I'll set the vertical to 900 pixels down. Click OK. Now that my image is offset, I'm going to fill in all the holes with more of my illustrations. So I'm going to select some of the designs that I didn't use and drag them onto the canvas. Again, play around with placing the illustrations to your liking. Once you're happy with the pattern, you can save this out. I believe the vendor I'm using only accepts JPEGs and PNG, so I'm going to save mine as a PNG. Go to File, Save As, and I'm actually just going to call this Pattern Tutorial 2 because I've already created this pattern earlier when I was testing it out. For the format, set to PNG, save, and OK. If you want to see how this pattern will look when it comes together, you can test it out by creating a new canvas. I'm going to just make mine a random size. And drag in the pattern file that you just saved. I'm using Command C and Command V to copy and paste. and just repeat it over and over. The design should connect on all 4 sides. So I'm pretty happy with how that looks. With our final pattern file, we can now order fabric from the vendor. I'm using Ripstop by the roll. I absolutely love them for any outdoor gear projects. On Ripstop's website, go to Print and select Custom Design Tool. Scroll down and click Start Designing. Select the green Upload Image button. Check the button I have right to use the image and click Upload Image. Select your pattern and click Open. The site's looking a little wonky, but click the small plus sign to apply the pattern. Under Manage your image size, I just want to make sure that the width and height are set to the same dimensions for which I designed the pattern. Remember, that was 7 inches by 6 inches, so I think it automatically doubled the size by 2, and I'm just going to correct that. For the fabric, you want to use a lightweight calendared ripstop. They have a regular and an eco version. The fabric is about 60 inches wide, but keep in mind the edges won't really be usable. I'm going to order 2 linear yards because I want my final blanket to be roughly 70 inches long. I'm going to select this box and add to cart. Now you need to order another piece of fabric in the same size for the back side. You can order the same pattern or even do a custom color that matches your pattern. But because custom fabric is quite expensive, I'm going to find a plain solid fabric in the same material that closely matches my design's color palette. So I'm going to come up to Shop, Fabric by Category, and Downproof. You can go with nylon or polyester. I'm going to select nylon because I think there are more color options. And I'm going to choose the 1.1 ounce ripstop. I'm going to select the foliage green because I think that best matches my design. Make sure you select calendared finish. For how to sand, I'm just going to select cut and folded. Again, I need 2 yards of this to match the size of the front of my blanket, but I'm also going to order an additional yard because I'm going to use this same fabric to create the binding of the blanket. So that's the border that's going to be sewn all the way around. And add to cart. After a couple weeks, I got my fabric in the mail, and look how freaking cute it looks. The first thing I'm doing is folding the entire piece of fabric in half lengthwise with the right sides together. I didn't use a pattern because the fabric was the perfect size as is. I did want to cut off the fuzzy edges / selvages, so here I'm just measuring an inch and cutting down the entire length of the fabric. The fabric is very slippery, so make sure to take your time. I also cut off the white strip along the top and bottom of the fabric. After I finished prepping my main fabric, I laid out the lining fabric and folded it in half lengthwise as well. It doesn't matter if it's right sides together or not. I refolded the main layer and laid it directly on top of the lining layer. I used a handful of wonder clips to keep the fabrics in place so that I can use the main fabric as a guide to cut the lining in the exact same size. To correct any uneven edges, I used this triangle ruler to make sure all the corners were squared. And with both of the fabric pieces ready, I went ahead and took off the wonder clips. Then I laid out my lining fabric with the shiny side facing up and placed the main fabric directly on top with the pattern side facing up, so basically wrong sides together. Again, I used wonder clips to hold the 2 layers together. If you have regular sewing pins, you can use those as well. However, I highly recommend the clips because they don't puncture the fabric. The less down you have slipping out, the better. And here I'm just finishing up the last edge. I sewed along the 2 sides and the bottom to create this big pocket. I left the top edge open because that is where I'm going to stuff the down filling. I really love these Schmetz Microtex needles. I have them in size 80/12, but a smaller needle is even better. You can see here I originally started with the walking foot, but I later decided that it was actually easier to sew with the regular foot. And again, because I wasn't using a pattern, I didn't pay much attention to the seam allowance, but I think I kept it around the 1/4 of an inch. This step may not be necessary, but after I sewed all 3 edges, I gave it a quick trim. At this point, you want to figure out how you want to separate your down feathers. I decided to go with 8 columns. My blanket was 55.5 inches from seam to seam, so I took that measurement and divided it by 8. And I just rounded up to 7 inches. I used a water-soluble fabric pencil to mark 7 inches apart all along the width of the blanket. I made a few of these markings and connected them to create a sewing guide for the entire length of the blanket. Starting from the bottom, I followed the guides and sewed all the way up the blanket. Because I had 8 columns, I had 7 lines to sew. Take your time on this part and make sure you keep both the top and bottom layers of the fabric nice and flat. The top edge didn't perfectly align when I finished sewing, so I just went ahead and trimmed it. And now it's time to stuff. My friend Nick sent me this goose down from Loose Goose Supply. It was my first time working with down, and it wasn't as scary as I thought it was going to be. I'm honestly already excited to work on my next down project. I wanted to use a total of 6 ounces of down for the entire blanket, so I divided that by 8, which is 3/4 of an ounce for each column. I'm not gonna lie, the stuffing took a long time. I'm sure there are other techniques for doing this part, but I just stuffed with my bare hands. And after I finished stuffing each column, I quickly basted the opening shut to prevent the feathers from falling out. With the blanket fully stuffed and looking nice and fluffy, the final step is to create the binding. For the binding, I cut long strips of fabric 2.5 inches wide on the bias. The bias is at a 45-degree angle, and this handy ruler has a convenient guide that I use to align with my fabric. Cut as many strips as you need to cover the entire border of your blanket. You also want to make sure that the ends of each strip are at a 45-degree angle. To create one continuous piece, I sewed the ends of 2 strips together, right sides together like so. I repeated this step with the rest of my binding pieces. Here's what the seam looks like from the right side. After I finished sewing the entire binding strip, I cut the 2 ends to have squared edges. There are many different ways to finish the binding of a quilt, so feel free to look at other tutorials for this part. With the right side of my blanket facing up, I took the strip of binding and folded it wrong sides, aka shiny sides, together in half. I aligned the raw edges of the binding with the raw edges of the blanket and sewed all the way around using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. You want to leave a couple inches of the binding unsewn on both ends. With the 2 open ends laying on top of each other, I trimmed the excess binding so that only 2.5 inches were overlapping. I opened up the 2 ends like so, placed them right sides together at a 90-degree angle, and sewed across from corner to corner. I accidentally sewed this all twisted up the first time, so make sure to check that you are sewing the correct sides together. The binding should sit flat against the edge of the blanket like so. Once I got it in the correct orientation, I finished sewing the binding to the blanket. And for the final step, I folded the open side of the binding to the back side of the blanket and hand sewed all the way around. To keep the seam nice and clean, I used a ladder stitch. To do this, pull the needle through the edge of the binding coming in from the back side. Then bring the needle directly across and pull it through a small section of the blanket fabric, making sure not to puncture the needle all the way through to the other side. Be patient and make sure to untangle the thread as you go. Again, bring the needle directly across and this time pull it through a small section of the binding fabric. Keep repeating this process. I'll link another video in the description about this stitch technique in case it's hard to see here. When I got to the corner, I simply folded it down like so to create a 90-degree angle. I sewed a couple stitches to secure it in place. Then I continued sewing all the way around the rest of the blanket. When I ran out of thread, I simply tied a knot and threaded another section of thread through my needle to keep going. The final step takes quite a bit of patience, so put on a movie, your favorite TV show, or if you want to be extra like me, take it outdoors and finish it while hanging out in your hammock. I promise I wasn't sad, it's just my face. Thanks so much for watching. As a thank you for 1,000 subs, I'll be giving away this blanket. All you have to do is like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below your favorite camp food. Good luck!